예, 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 소개받은 스탠퍼드대학교 신규 교수입니다. 아까 말씀드린 대로 저희가 2년 전에 최종현학술원 그다음에 고등교육재단하고 그러니까 지속 가능한 민주주의 라운드테이블, 그러니까 Sustainable Democracy 라운드테이블을 이제 진행하고 있고요. 그래서 어제는 저희가 이제 비공개로 회의를 하고 오늘은 국회에 와서 이에 대해서 굉장히 기쁘고 반갑게 생각하고 또 이렇게 많이 오셔서 감사드립니다. 저희가 아무래도 이제 패널리스트들이 다 이제 주로 이제 미국에서 오셨기 때문에 제가 진행은 영어로 하고 통역하는 걸로 그렇게 하겠습니다. So thank you for joining us today. As you know, we are at a critical juncture for democracy. Given the recent and ongoing crisis in both South Korea and the United States. Through our democracy roundtable, we thought to engage deeply with the structural, institutional, and ideological factors contributing to democratic erosion, while also emphasizing solutions, pathways to renewal, reform, and resilience. So yesterday, we explored the fragility and resilience of Korean democracy, the global challenges to liberal democratic norms, and practical strategies for strengthening democratic institutions. I was especially happy to have scholars with a wide range of perspectives as they were thoughtful, engaging, and refreshingly honest. Their nuanced reflections were a valuable contribution to our shared effort to understand and sustain democracy in turbulent times. So today, we turn our attention to one of the most urgent and widespread challenges facing democracies around the world: political polarization. In recent years, democratic societies worldwide, including Korea, have witnessed a sharp increase in political polarization. These divisions pose significant threat not only to political stability, but also to overall societal cohesion as partisanship intensifies and compromise becomes increasingly elusive. Polarization undermines trust in democratic institutions, weakens effective governance, and hampers our collective ability to address critical societal challenges. So today's session will examine these dynamics closely with a particular focus on Korea and the United States. So more specifically, our panelists are going to address the following questions. So what factors contribute to political polarization, and how does this polarization challenge democratic governance? What are similarities and differences between political polarization in Korea and the United States? What role do social media and digital algorithms play in exacerbating polarization? What effective strategies can be drawn from international experiences to address polarization? So how can we bridge political divide and foster dialogue? What kind of institutional reforms can resolve deepening polarization? So I'm very happy to have four eminent scholars at this panel. So we have three colleagues from Stanford to join us, and then one scholar from Korea. And we have two political scientists and two sociologists, two male and two female. We have gender balance. So we try to avoid any polarization in any way, so in discipline, gender, and also nationality, I think. So First, we're going to hear from Professor Fukuyama, and I don't think he needs an introduction, but I think I'll turn to him first, and then each speaker will speak for about 8 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Shin. I'm really honored to be at this meeting at the National Assembly, a very inspiring building where inspiring things happened over the past half year. So I want to talk about two sources of polarization. The first one has to do with gender, and the second one has to do with social media. I think that gender has become an important source of polarization in both Korea and in the United States. One of the reasons that President Trump was elected is that a lot of young men swung to voting for him instead of Kamala Harris as the election went on. As I understand it, young men also voted for the right-wing candidates in the Korean election. And I think that it's important to understand why gender has become such a big issue. There's a tendency to think about gender in terms of ideology, that somehow you had this doctrine of feminism that sprang up out of nowhere and has been affecting the way that jobs and opportunities are being allocated in the society. And I think that misunderstands what's really happening. I believe that the big shifts in female labor force participation really began in developed countries beginning in the late 1960s, when millions, literally tens or hundreds of millions of women began to move into workforces all over the industrialized world. And this shift was not driven by ideology, it was driven by economics, because the whole world was moving at that moment from a industrial economy to a service information economy. And it's simply the case that in a service information economy, women have a much more natural place in the labor force. They're much better, quite frankly, in low skill, especially in low skill, low education positions at younger ages than young men are. They're more reliable, they show up on time, they work harder, and there's a lot of reasons why employers prefer having women in those positions. And what that's meant is that in many cases, in families, in relationships, women have ended up being the primary earners in the couple. And this has obviously not gone well with a lot of young men who feel that their traditional social roles as the provider in the family is being undermined. But this is an inevitable consequence of something nobody can do anything about, which is the technological shift that leads us into an information economy. I think what we need to do to deal with this polarization is to recognize that actually, in many respects, young men are in a very problematic position in our economies. There was a Brookings scholar, Richard Reeves, that wrote a whole book about men and boys, indicating how across the world, women were outcompeting men in universities. In the United States, I think more than 60% of undergraduates are female. This is even true in Iran and Saudi Arabia. I mean, in many, many different kinds of societies. And it's going to lead to, I think, a deterioration of the social situation, especially of young men, and especially young men with poor educational backgrounds. And so there are a number of ways of mitigating this that Reeves suggests. For example, don't send boys to school so early in their lives because they mature more slowly than girls do. There are other adjustments that I think can be made, but we have to recognize that in a way women have a permanent advantage in labor markets in contemporary economies over men, and in a way it's sort of men that we have to focus public policy on. All right, so that's the first issue. Second issue has to do with social media. Now I think, I imagine some of the other panelists will address this as well. The problem with social media is it's controlled by a small number of exclusively American platforms that have algorithms that feed users certain kinds of information and not others. And those algorithms are written for the benefit of those companies' bottom lines. They're not written in order to preserve democracy or to create social stability or anything like that. And it turns out that if you simply let users pick the kind of content they want to see, they like more extreme content. They like things that are edgy or abusive or in some way test the boundaries of social civility. And that, I'll just give you one little example of this. It turned out that in the United States, young mothers that were attending yoga classes online began to also join conspiracy theory forums related to QAnon, right? Now, why should a young mother interested in yoga be interested in this particular conspiracy theory? Well, it turns out that one prominent yoga guru was interested in this particular conspiracy theory, and the computer algorithm on the platform said, well, if you like yoga, you must like conspiracy theories, and if you like this conspiracy theory, there's a whole bunch of other conspiracy theories that we can point you to. And this is the way in which I think bad or toxic information tends to get accelerated. I led a Stanford working group on platform scale a few years ago in which we tried to come up with a solution to this problem. And I think that the existing solutions are not good. The current solution in the United States is to let the platforms do whatever they want, and that's not a solution. I don't think that you want the government to be the one to establish what the truth is or what people ought to be thinking and believing. I think this contradicts basic principles of freedom of speech. But then that leaves the question open, who does, if you're going to moderate the content of the internet, who is going to do this? The Europeans have decided that the state is going to regulate this, and I think it shows some of the dangers of that because you can't have neutral regulation of political speech. It is not going to be interpreted as neutral. That's why we don't do it in the United States, because conservatives came to believe that all efforts to regulate and moderate media content were aimed at them. They were taken up by left-wing people that wanted to suppress conservative voices, and that's why politically it's not possible to do that. In Europe, they're trying to do this. I think they've actually gone a little bit too far. You can actually be sent to jail for several months in Britain for posting certain kinds of comments on Twitter. I mean, it's really, I think, a real threat to freedom of speech. Our solution was what we called middleware, where we would try to take the content moderation function away from these big tech platforms and give it to independent third-party moderators, where you, the user, could choose what kind of material you saw in your social media feed. So it wouldn't be X or Meta or any of these big platforms. It would be a content moderator you selected. I can't get into much more than this. Those of you that have been on Reddit as opposed to X or Facebook will understand what that kind of moderation means. It means that you stay contained within a relatively small space where you don't get introduced to a conspiracy theory just because you like yoga. If you like yoga, you're going to stay in a yoga space. And I think that this, as far as I can see, is the only realistic way of addressing this social media problem. So with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Frank. I think that certainly gender and social media also have contributed to political polarization in Korea, maybe in more extreme form, so we can come back to discuss. those issues for Korea and United States. So now let me turn to Dr. Didi Kuo. She's a political scientist specializing on democratization, political parties, and state building, and so on. Her latest book includes The Great Retreat, How Political Parties Should Behave and Why They Don't. So let me turn to Didi.
Thank you so much to the National Assembly, to the Che Institute for hosting us. It's been a real honor to be able to visit Seoul, my first time in South Korea. So there has been democratic backsliding going on for most of the 21st century, at least since 2005, when more countries are either stalled in their transition to democracy than they are moving towards democratic consolidation. And the United States has been part of that pattern. Since at least 2016, many democracy watchdog organizations have downgraded the United States democracy score. And since January, we see that many problems with democracy have been amplified. So today I'm going to focus on some of the backdrop of challenges to American democracy. The first is political polarization, which is a problem not just in the United States, but obviously in other countries such as South Korea. Polarization in the United States is characterized by huge differences between the Republican and Democratic parties, both ideological and also affective in terms of how people see themselves versus the other party. It makes politics feel very high stakes and sometimes existential, with each election feeling like a knife's edge, narrow margin that could determine many different outcomes that are very consequential for democracy. Now, in the United States, there are many causes of political polarization. One is our system of primary elections, which give the public the right to select candidates. Voters can choose these candidates and oftentimes have very low turnout elections that just draw the most ideological voters. There's also campaign finance. We have very porous campaign finance, and donors tend to be more ideological than average voters. We have a winner-take-all system of first-past-the-post elections in which a plurality of the vote winner can then win the entire election. We also have more partisan media, which is very much affected by social media, but on cable television, there's active partisan news. Talk radio is also a source of partisan media, and increasingly, podcasts are a source of information echo chambers, which was also mentioned in the first panel. And finally, with very narrow electoral margins in congressional races, that can amplify the tendency to polarize in campaigns and engage in a lot of negative campaigning and us versus them rhetoric that is becoming increasingly inflamed. But in addition to polarization, the other factors that are driving challenges to American democracy include economic inequality, which has been growing in the United States for at least the past 40 or 50 years. The United States is the most unequal country in the OECD. The politics of globalization and free trade have resulted in deindustrialization across the United States, producing winners in the major cities of the US, particularly highly educated professional workers, and also producing many losers, particularly in places that are experiencing either trade shocks or deindustrialization, people with lower levels of education. And as a result, there's less economic mobility, fewer job opportunities in many places across the United States, and rising economic insecurity. The cost of living has gone up a lot for the costs of housing, healthcare, and education. And this has resulted in feelings of grievance or being left behind, and also a feeling that the parties are not responsive to the economic concerns of everyday citizens. Another factor driving polarization is racial resentment. The United States is very racially diverse, but has also long had problems with racial backlash, politics of sort of racial progress that is then accompanied by backlash. It was not until 1965, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, that we really became a multiracial democracy and Black Americans could achieve the same political rights as white Americans. But that doesn't mean that there is actually racial equality. And much of what we're seeing, particularly from the far right, is a backlash to higher levels of immigration that have taken place since the 1970s, with immigrants coming from Latin America and also from Asia, and really changing the racial composition of the United States. And finally, there has just been a lot of distrust in government. This is true not just in the US, but around the world. There's been more rejection of the political parties and of the polarized system. So people have become more likely to see the entire political system as corrupt and self-serving. And that makes democracies vulnerable to the appeals of populists and extremists who say they just want to burn the system down. But right now, in this moment, the biggest threat to American democracy comes from the president himself, from the MAGA faction of the Republican Party. Since taking office, there has been a huge effort to centralize power in the office of the executive. Someone mentioned the imperial presidency. In the United States, we call this unitary executive theory, where the president is giving himself more power to appoint bureaucrats, to politicize many neutral offices, and to get rid of horizontal and vertical accountability. There has been more effort to ignore court rulings, for example, and to attack the opposition, including liberal institutions of higher education, the media, judges, etc. There's also been a denial of election results and more distrust in the democratic process overall, which culminated in an insurrection on January 6, 2021, when President Trump lost re-election a few years ago. Now, some signs of hope and also some lessons from other countries that have experienced democratic backsliding provide us with a template for how we might move out of this political moment. The first is the courts are serving as a check on some of the administration's overreach. President Trump has lost many rulings in the lower courts. Civil society has also become more and more active. I think Americans don't necessarily have the same tradition of protest politics as Koreans do, but every weekend you're seeing more and more people coming out onto the streets to demonstrate, especially last Saturday, the No Kings protests, as President Trump held a military parade on his birthday. We also need more institutions of accountability around the office of the presidency himself. We don't have many conflict of interest laws in the United States. We don't have laws that prevent people who have criminal backgrounds, for example, for running for president. And so in the future, that is something that Congress needs to consider. It would also be helpful to have broad pro-democracy bipartisan coalitions, which we've seen emerge in other countries like France, Brazil, Poland, where many different civil society actors and activists and political parties put aside their political differences to advocate, a pro-democracy message in order to defeat an illiberal incumbent. And finally, we can hope that the center, the political center, whether it's composed of the center right and the center left, can reconstitute themselves to win at the ballot box. The electoral defeat of extremism is probably the most important way to rebuild democracy. And then they can recommit to sets of democratic values moving forward and more responsive sets of policies to meet the needs and concerns of citizens and govern effectively in the 21st century. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think certainly economic inequality and also distrust in government apply to Korea very well. Yesterday, Professor EJL of SNU presented about growing inequality, not only in income, but also real estate and even networks. I think that was the most striking. To hear that inequality in networks really very important for Korean case, and also as you know, United States has a federal system, and one thing really hard for Korean to understand is that like ongoing lawsuit between states and federal government. So despite Trump's power, there are a lot of laws going on between federal states and then state government. Okay, now let me turn to my colleague Kiyoteru Tsutsui. He's professor of sociology and also senior fellow at FSI. So we are colleagues in both sociology and FSI, and he's an expert on Japan, but also he has done research on global diffusion of norms, and I believe you are leading large project to compare polarization among different countries. So, Kiyo?
Thank you, Georg, for the kind introduction, and it's an honor to be in this building National Assembly. Thanks to Giwoka, I've been to Korea many times, but this is my first time in this building, and speaking here is a very significant, meaningful moment, especially considering what that country went through in this year. And hearing some of the speeches this morning and also yesterday at a conference, my sense is that South Korean democracy has kind of turned the page, and it's resilient. It withstood the challenges of the last several months. You have a new president now, and it's moving forward with, and I heard a lot of confidence this morning from the two politicians, and that was great to hear. As we look at the United States, I can't say the same. We still have 3 more years of the same president, and I'm actually worried about going back to the United States, whether I can get back there or not. I'm not going to say too much about President Trump at this session because it's a public session. So I'm going to try to talk about sort of broader literature that looked at populism and polarization in the world and what factors contribute to deepening divisions within different societies and globally, and try to figure out how US and Korea kind of match up in terms of those different factors. So in the literature on populism, there are at least 3, broadly speaking, 3 factors that are particularly potent, can become potent weapons for populist demagogues, leaders, in mobilizing votes for themselves. It's economic insecurity, cultural insecurity, and political insecurity, and I'm going to explain one by one. So economic insecurity, obviously, we already talked about growing economic inequality or perception of that. Effective populists actually exploit the perception, if not reality, of economic inequality. I don't think in 2016 economic inequality in the US was more severe than some years ago, but then President Trump framed the argument effectively to mobilize support for himself, talking about deindustrialization and Rust Belt regions and declining middle and lower class, working class in the US. So this sense of economic decline, economic insecurity is often an important factor, and I think there is that in this country from what I hear, the sense that the economic future, especially for the young generations, with relatively high unemployment rate and housing instability, all these factors probably contribute to the polarization, especially in what I hear about gender wars in this country. The second factor is cultural insecurity. This is a threat, perceived, again, threat to the sort of cultural integrity of the nation. There are others, quote unquote, coming into the country, often in the form of immigrants and foreigners coming to the country, especially foreigners with very significantly different cultural, religious, linguistic lifestyles. That could be a threat, perceived threat, undermining the traditional ways of life in the country, and a lot of people react against it. Gender norms also play a role here. A role of women in society changes, and often it is perceived that outside entities in countries like Korea or Japan, outside entities are seen to be interfering in the domestic sort of cultural life, imposing quote unquote Western gender norms in East Asian societies. So that also becomes a potent weapon. The third factor is political threat to national sovereignty. This is more of the case in European countries than in other countries, but EU imposing its will on different EU member states, that we saw that in Brexit, the reaction against it, and reassertion of political sovereignty in the nation. That also gives a lot of power to populist messagers. So in Korea, I talked about economics. So in terms of cultural insecurity, I think there's this gender issue that's quite prominent in Korea. And in the US, obviously, the immigration is a huge issue, and President Trump really leveraged this point to his advantage. Political sovereignty, I'm not sure. I mean, US certainly it does not feel like other countries are imposing their will. In South Korea, I don't know exactly what's happening on this front, but in Asia, there's no strong regional organization like the EU. So this might not be as relevant an issue. So these are three factors that produce the pool of sentiments that can be mobilized by populist leaders. But there are another three players that are important in elevating that into these sentiments into political movements, or political parties, actual policy changes. The first one is the leaders, demagogues, populist leaders. Very effective ones look like President Trump, who is a charismatic leader who can mobilize people with his, no matter what you think of him, he's very effective at messaging. And that exists in the United States. I don't know if that exists in South Korea. Maybe one reason why South Korean democracy got back to some sense of normalcy is that it did not face the kind of coordinated, premeditated attack on democratic institutions with a charismatic leader, like especially the second Trump administration. So on that front, maybe Korea is better off today because of that, a lack of effective leader. The second factor is democratic institutions. These layers of checks and balances can be a safeguard against the rise of populist authoritarian leader. So there is, as Didi talked about, there is some hope in that in the United States because there are a lot of layers, and courts have fended off some of the changes that President Trump tried to push through. So that may contribute to preserving of democracy. In this country too, I think we saw that in this building, there was a lot of efforts to defend democracy. The flip side of that also, although, is that Frank talked about this yesterday, the excessive proceduralism that leads to the sense of inefficacy of politics among the public, meaning that there are a lot of checks and balances mean that there are many veto points, and effective policy, carrying out an effective policy is a difficult endeavor for countries with strong democratic institutions. So these are two sides of the same coin. Strong democratic institutions with layers of checks and balances prevent populist demagogues from rising quickly, but at the same time, it actually prevents effective policies that the public wants from being implemented quickly, leading to resentment and frustration among the public, which could lead to populist demand for strong leaders that could lead to populist authoritarianism. Finally, quickly, social media. Frank already talked about this today, so I'm not going to say too much, but social media, I'm convinced, that is a very potent tool for populists because populist leaders can speak directly to the constituents, their supporters, and mobilize support for themselves. And there has to be a lot that needs to be done. And I would, if we have more time, I would talk about how we need to see social media as public common goods that need to be regulated by the government. And that would really change the dynamic of growing polarization through social media. But we have a long way to go because social media is a relatively new media. And there's a lot of efforts in countries like Taiwan, Japan, by people like Audrey Tang, Glenn Weil, Ken Suzuki. All those people are thinking about new ways of using technology to address this issue. But I'm going to stop here.
For identifying three key factors and three actors contributing to political polarization, hopefully we can come back to some of that. Last but not the least, Professor Lee Suk-jong from Sungkyunkwan University. Among other things, she is now leading a very important project, which is Indo-Pacific Democracy Forum. I think in my view, this is very important because United States now really cutting budget on national endowment for democracy, I think it will be weakened. And now, given that Korea showed democratic resilience over the last 6 months, I think Korea can be a leader in promoting democracy, maybe in the Indo-Pacific region and also maybe even globally. So I hope that the Assembly can support this project. So, Professor Lee.
Thank you very much, Professor Shin Gyu, for supporting IPDF. I should invite all the American speakers as an honorary member of IPDF. Thank you so much. 먼저 이제 저희가 쉽게 양극화다, 정치 양극화다라고 말하는데 정치 양극화가 뭐냐? 첫 번째 질문. 두 번째 질문은 정치 양극화가 왜 민주주의에 나쁜가에 관한 거. 그다음에 세 번째 질문은 미국과 한국의 정치 양극화가 세계의 다른 나라에 비해서 얼마나 심각한가라는 것. 그다음에 네 번째는 그럼에도 불구하고 한국의 정치 양극화를 너무 단순하게 해석하면 안 된다. 여기 다른 분석들이 있고 주장들이 있습니다. 그리고 마지막으로 그러면 이런 양극화를 탈양극화, 우리가 polarization 말하는데요. 어떤 방안이 있을까? 이것으로 말씀드리겠습니다. 먼저 우리가 양극화라고 하는 것은 사람들을 어떤 가치나 정체성 아니면 정책 방향에 대해서 두 가지의 다른 캠프로 나누는 것입니다. 그러면은 민주주의 국가에서는 정책 방향이 다 다르고 하니까 정당들이 정책 경쟁을 하면서 표를 달라고 유권자에게 호소하기 때문에 다른 정책이 있고 다른 건 너무 당연합니다. 우리가 1세션에서 말했듯이 다원주의와 달리 이거는 서로 다른 여러 가지 이해관계에 다름이 있는데 그걸 단순화해서 우리와 상대방으로 나누기 때문에 그래 둘이 적대적 관계가 되는 것인데요. 그러다 보니까 서로 상대방을 자기한테 대한 실존적인 위협으로 간주하게 되고 거기서 불신, 미움, 심지어는 폭력으로까지 이어집니다. 자, 그러면은 우리가 보통 양극화라고 얘기할 때 두 가지를 생각하셔야 되는데요. 얼마나 일반적인 사회에서 양극화가 일어나느냐. 우리는 그것을 사회적 양극화, social polarization이라고 말합니다. 그런데 그것이 정치 영역에서 정당들이 어떻게 이것을 동원해서 정파적인 파티, 정당 간 양극화로 일어나느냐라고 구별하셔야 되는데요. 어떤 경우에는 그 사회적인 기반이 없음에도 불구하고 어떤 파퓰리스트 정당들이 나와서 이것을 정파적으로 악용해서 하기도 합니다. 그래서 이게 어떻게 이게 온라인이 되느냐, 사회적인 양극화와 그 정당 간 정파적인 양극화가 연계되느냐를 연구하는 것이 굉장히 중요한데요. 대개 이렇습니다. 만약에 정당이 이걸 잘 동원해서 그런 양대 정당이 있다고 하면은 이 정당 간의 선거 전략으로서 그 쌍방의 관계가 있게 되는 것이에요. 그래서 그걸 활용을 해서 하면 양극화가 굉장히 나빠지게 되고 만약에 이런 정당이 그런 전략도 없고 동원 능력도 없다면 어떤 캠프를 대변하는 정당의 압도적인 우위에 있게 됩니다. 그렇게 되면은 사실은 그건 엄밀한 의미의 정치적 양극화가 아니라 일당이 도미넌트하는 그런 정치 체제가 되게 되는데요. 한국과 미국은 그것도 주요 양대 정당이 이 동원 능력이 있기 때문에 이게 어떻게 보면 지속되는 양극화가 지속될 수 있는 그러한 구조를 갖고 있습니다. 그렇다면 한국 사회에 정말로 양극화의 기반이 될 수 있는 사회적 균열이 있는가? 저는 거기에 대해서 조금 질문이 있습니다. 왜냐하면 지금 유럽에서 일어나는 것, 미국에서 일어나는 것을 보면 우리가 양극화가 일어날 때 몇 가지의 원천이 있는데 하나가 반세계화입니다. 그러니까 세계화가 돼서 엘리트들만 과시를 받고 농촌이라든지 아니면은 그런 세계화의 물결에 올라탈 수 없던 사람은 더욱더 가난해지고 이런 담론이 있습니다. 그런데 한국과 또 많은 개도국에서는 반세계화가 그러니까 보호주의 무역이랄까 이러한 것들이 사회적인 균열 구조에서 별로 힘이 없습니다. 그래서 그거에 중요한 또 하나가 이민인데 우리는 이제 노동자를 외국인 노동자를 활용하지만 뭐 이민이라든 이런 문제가 크지 않습니다. 그래서 우리는 극좌 정당도 없고 극우 정당도 없습니다. 그래서 그런 점에서 한국이 그렇게 사회적인 균열이 심각하다고까지는 저는 보고 있지 않는데요. 그럼에도 불구하고 많은 서베이들이 있습니다. 예를 들어서 민주주의 다양성 연구소에서 내는 정치 양극화에 의하면 제가 아시아 그 양극화들을 봤더니 우리나라가 인도 다음으로 지금 양극화가 제일 큰 것으로 민주주의 다양성 연구자들이 측정을 했고 그래서 최근 수년간 굉장히 발전을 했습니다. 그리고 퓨 리서치 연구소라는 것이 있는데 거기서 2021년에 17개국의 선진 자본주의 국가를 조사했는데 여기서도 90%가 양극화가 심각하다는 답이 나온 나라가 미국하고 한국이었어요. 그리고 한국의 사회통합 서베이라는 것이 매년 나오는데 거기서도 진보와 보수의 2년간의 양극화가 한국에서 제일 심한 것으로 한국인들도 인식하고 있습니다. 그러면 이렇게 주관적인 서베이들은 굉장히 심하다고 하는데요. 하지만 우리 유권자의 분포를 봅시다. 우리 양극화라고 할 때는 우리가 이제 만약에 왼편부터 오른편으로 그래프를 그린다고 하면 정규 분포에서는 일봉 곡선입니다. 그러니까 중간이 많고 왼쪽과 오른쪽에 극단적인 것에 작은 그러한 일봉 곡선을 정규 분포를 그리는데요. 우리가 양극화라고 하는 것은 이것이 극단으로 가서 중도가 줄어들고 그다음에 양쪽 진영을 지지하는 사람들 간에 겹치는 게 줄어들 때 우리가 양극화가 진행됐다고 말할 수 있습니다. 그런데 한 가지 다행인 것은 한국에서 우리들의 이념적인 지향성을 조사했을 때 중도가 여전히 40%를 갖고 있습니다. 그래서 우리가 이제 이른바 왼쪽 오른쪽 하는 것은 3 있기 때문에 3대 4대 3으로 되어 있습니다. 그래서 아직도 중도가 강한 한국에서는 스폰지 역할을 한다 하는 게 있고요. 자, 그러면은 이념적인 양극화 또는 정서적인 양극화가 어떻게 진행됐는가를 보면은 그때는 우리가 민주당을 지지하는 사람과 국민의힘을 지지하는 사람들의 유권자를 갖고 비교를 합니다. 이것을 보면은 이데올로기적인 양극화가 조금 진행이 됐고요. 그 다음에 서로 미워하는 양당의 지지자 간이 서로 상대방 당을 또 그 당의 지도자를 미워하는 것은 정서적인 양극화는 최근 수년간 상당히 진행이 됐습니다. 그래서 그렇다면은 우리가 이거를 굉장히 심각한 문제다. 이걸 그냥 우리가 놔두지 않으면 우리도 굉장히 민주주의의 해가 될 것 같다가 어떤 액션을 취해야 되겠죠. 그래서 우리가 1세션에서 어떻게 이제 양극화를 좀 완화시킬 수 있느냐가 많은 얘기가 나왔어요. 그래서 이제 제3당이 나온다든지 어떤 그런 비례를 활용해서 이런 좀 양당 간의 어떤 중간적인 역할을 할 수 있는 그런 제3의 세력을 만드는 얘기를 했고, 그 다음에 소셜 미디어 같은 걸에 너무 이런 극단적인 그런 컨텐츠에 끌려들지 않도록 시민교육 얘기도 많이 했고요. 근데 이제 제가 한국을 조사해 보면 놀라운 것은 한국의 신문 수가 너무 많습니다. 한국의 일간지가 342개가 지금 문화체육관광부의 정기 간행물 등록 현황을 보면 올해 2월 수치인데요. 다른 선진민주국가를 봤을 때 이렇게 일간지가 많은 데가 없습니다. 그런데 인터넷 신문 수가 몇 개인 줄 아십니까? 인터넷 신문이 1만 2천여 개로 등록되어 있습니다. 1만 2천여 개입니다. 그러니까 여러분 기억하시죠? 그 지난번에 뭐 어떤 인터넷 신문에서 저기 뭐 중국인들을 선거관리위원회에서 어떻게 연수를 시켜서 주한미군이 그 사람들을 뭐 어디를 보내려고 했다. 말도 안 되잖아요. 근데 그걸 믿는 사람들이 의외로 지식층 중에서도 상당히 많아서 좀 충격을 받았습니다. 그렇기 때문에 항상 이 인터넷 신문들이 만들어내는 이런 허위 정보, 오보를 어떻게 우리가 걸러낼 거냐. 저는 항상 친구들한테 너 배웠지 않냐. 거기 소스를 봐라. 신문의 소스를 봐라. 근거도 없는 데서 주장하는 것을 절대로 믿지 마라라고 많이 합니다. 그래서 이거 역시 규제를 해야 되는데 저희가 국회에서 규제를 하려고 2차례나 노력했습니다. 근데 안 됩니다. 정권이 바뀔 때마다 이거는 표현의 자유, 우리가 반대하려는 야당을 압박하기 위한 법이다 해서 합의가 안 됩니다. 그래서 여기에 대해서 우리가 조금 초당적인 어느 정도로 규제할 것이냐 하는 것을 다시 논의해야 될 거라고 생각합니다. 줄이겠습니다.
예, 감사합니다. Okay, so I think we identify many factors contributing to political polarization that may apply to Korea as well. So before opening to the floor for questions, I'd like to go one more round, asking them what to do. I mean, like gender, social media, inequality, or distrusting government. So maybe we can go around, maybe one more round, giving your insights about what to do, and then I'll open to the floor. Especially, I love the question from students, so you can think about your questions. So, Frank.
Okay, thank you. Well, I actually gave you some solutions, but let me go over them again. I think that given the resentment of young men in the face of these changing socioeconomic conditions where women are outcompeting them, I think that political parties need to adjust their appeals. So I don't know the situation in Korea well enough to speak about that, but if you look at the American election last November, Kamala Harris, when she addressed gender issues, the central issue she addressed was abortion. Now, the reason she did this was that it turned out that abortion is a very powerful motivator for American women to come vote and to vote Democratic. There had been a number of by-elections in which, even in a red state, there was a big pro-abortion vote that was motivated by the Supreme Court's decision to cancel the constitutional right to abortion. So there was a good logic behind that. But I think in retrospect, a lot of people in the Democratic Party recognized that that message really didn't have any resonance with young men. I mean, young men are not going to go vote, especially low propensity voters, over something like that. And there wasn't anything really in her campaign that spoke to young men. Now, the way you don't want to speak to young men is the way Donald Trump did it, by going to these UFC fighting matches and having all these guys with big muscles, be his advocates. I mean, stylistically, it was actually, I think, quite effective. But there's a way of appealing, I think, to men that does not involve that kind of toxic masculine symbolism that also would speak to issues that men, especially young men, really care about. And I think if you are going to fight this kind of polarization, you got to think of what that is. And then in terms of the social media, as I said, when we looked at this question, it seemed that this middleware solution we had was really the only viable one. In a country that is already polarized, you're never going to get to a point where the government can start regulating the media, because one side or the other is going to regard that as aimed at them, and they're going to oppose it, and that's exactly what happened in the United States. The one thing I like about my middleware solution is it's politically neutral. It does not help, obviously, one side of the political divide over the other. It simply says users should determine the kind of material that they see when they go on social media, and not a social media company. That's the basic principle, and I think that's why I think you can actually do this kind of a reform, whereas, the government getting into the business of regulating social media, I think, is simply not doable in a society that's already highly polarized.
Okay, so in Korean case, YouTube, is really playing a very important role. And then, individual people can make their own YouTube. And then there's a lot of misinformation. And then also there's some business interest, because you can make a lot of money, actually. So then what can government do? I mean, as you mentioned, maybe regulation may not be a solution, but still at the same time, there must be something. Otherwise, it's just getting worse and worse. Seems like.
So I spend a lot of time on YouTube. I have my own YouTube channel.
But not yours. But
No, I'm going to tell you. So I think the real problem is YouTube's recommendation algorithm.
right.
So it follows what you look at, and then it gives you more of it. And then it gives you more extreme versions of what you've been looking at. And so if you let that go on, you're going to get sucked into all sorts of videos that you would never have looked at if you had just made the choice. And so what I think this middleware solution does is it gives you a little dial on your browser, and it says, I don't want to see, conspiracy theory videos just because I like yoga, Like I said, Reddit is actually a good model for this because the subreddits are very narrowly focused and they're moderated. And if you try to show a conspiracy video in the midst of let's say a carpentry subreddit where people are interested in woodworking, and all of a sudden a conspiracy theory video shows up, the moderator is going to say, "Get this out of here! You're not. This is something specialized in carpentry, and so let's stick to that." So I think that that's really the thing that the social media companies contribute is these recommendation algorithms that push people into positions that they otherwise would not have naturally taken.
Okay. Didi or Kiyo, Sukjong, yeah.
There are some buckets of solutions, but I think some of them are not necessarily realistic. So there are some institutional solutions in the United States, like electoral system reform, reforming first past the post to multi-member districts and proportional representation, which would lead to more parties, changing party primaries so that parties have more of a say in selecting candidates. They tend to pick more moderates, or campaign finance reform. Unfortunately, I think all of those are not likely in the near future. You can also think of sort of agency-based solutions like better leaders, people who understand that they need to de-escalate violent or highly hostile rhetoric against the other party. We do have like a problem solvers caucus in Congress of people who are willing to work across the aisle and compromise. But you can hope for better leaders, but that doesn't necessarily mean you get them. But finally, I think that a set of potential solutions are to help with bridging and mobilization opportunities for citizens. So there's a lot of evidence that local political engagement and civic engagement, going back to Bob Putnam and Tocqueville before him, can really help people develop a sense of political agency and efficacy and work on deliberation and compromise. There's also, I think, rebuilding political parties to make them more engaged with the local communities that they serve and allowing more of a bottom-up process, or what Giovanni Sartori called a transmission belt of ideas between society and party elites, is another way to generate more responsive policies in the short term.
Okay, so Didi, you are experts on political parties. So you said that we can revitalize a political party. Does it mean we are going back to old style of party, or given we are living in new era, the party may have to transform into something different?
Absolutely.
So what kind of party should we expect?
I expect that there will need to be a lot of innovation and policy entrepreneurship in how you reestablish a party. My students hate parties. They would never get involved in a party. At Stanford, actually, this fall, during a presidential election, we basically had a dormant Republican and Democratic student group. And those are very important mechanisms to developing a bench of future party activists. So I think that probably using digital technology, and this is something new parties in Europe have been able to do. I don't know how sustainable it is. We're not going to go back to the mass party era, but I think that the elite parties alone that are very professional, that only rely on consultants and marketing strategists, that is also not sustainable in the long run. So I suspect it'll be a combination of localism and also tech that helps parties rebuild for the future.
Okay, Kiyo?
So addressing economic, cultural, political insecurity is certainly important with policies. And also yesterday we talked a lot about democratic education, the importance of that, media literacy, social media, especially literacy education. Those things take a long time. So more in the shorter term, I would say that this might be somewhat controversial, but not everything that's done in the name of democracy contributes to democracy. So for instance, primaries in the US election are established to democratize the system, to avoid exclusive control by party elites of that process. Primaries have become a huge problem in the US presidential election and also other political office, elections for any political office in the US. So that didn't contribute to democracy in the long run. And social media was seen as a democratization of media, right? It's to avoid control of elite mainstream media, print and television and radio. And now everybody can actually become media and transmit information and news and news analysis on their own. And that had some merits in the era of the Arab Spring, and so it did some democratization work. But now we are faced with this sort of excessive democratization of media into social media, where all these extreme messages, as Frank said, are spread because of the algorithmic concerns. So this one in particular, social media, I think can be addressed with more of a control, control of those medias that may not be popular at the beginning, but I think it's very important. In the same way that television, TV media, they have to have some kind of license to broadcast their programs. And if they engage in excessive fake news reporting, there's some consequence. I don't know how it works in Korea, but I would imagine that there are some consequences to false reporting, intentional false reporting of news. So, but there's none of that in social media, really. So that has to change, and it really takes the government regulation with public support to make that happen. And I don't know if it's likely or imminent, but there should be more campaign for that. Now, I'd end with a more optimistic note of using AI, artificial intelligence. There's a lot of negative aspects to AI, and there's a lot of scary sides to AI. But there have been some efforts by sort of techno-visionaries using AI. For instance, there's a program application called Particle that gives you sort of both sides of arguments kind of analysis of news. I don't know if it's available in Korea, but it is in the US. It has contracts with the AP and all these news media, and then it uses AI to present both sides of the argument for whatever Trump policy. There's Trump supporter side and Trump opposition side. And something like the Smart News also does something like that. That kind of media consumption, news consumption might be the future wave. There's also something called broad listening that is popularized by Ken Suzuki and Takahiro Anno. Some of my friends in Japan have started doing it, and also Audrey Tan has done it in Taiwan. Listening to, it's hard to do focus group. Focus groups can only do like dozens of people at most, right? But if you use AI, thousands of people, if not millions, perhaps millions, can make input on a policy discussion. And then AI can mediate and summarize some of the key arguments on different fronts, from different sides. And that actually helps moderate the discussion in the direction of more of a compromise, but also public has greater sense of political efficacy, because they can participate in the process and they feel like their views are reflected. So something like that, using AI in a positive democratic way could actually alleviate some of the problems.
So given your expertise in Japan, let me ask one follow-up question. So I guess political polarization is not as serious in Japan as in Korea or United States, right? That's my understanding. So what's the secret? Maybe I shouldn't be asking this question in the assembly, but what can Korea learn from
Yeah, so,
Japan in that regard? Yeah.
So in terms of stability, Japan has done quite well. But in terms of political dynamism, not so much.
Yeah.
So it's two sides of the same coin. And it's interesting because in Japan, there have been a lot of talks of, or maybe Japan should move to a two-party system where political, power changes hands more frequently, and then that some kind of dynamism is introduced so that policy changes, necessary policies can be implemented more quickly. And there was even talk of like moving to presidential system, not very seriously, but so there was more desire for power change. That was like 20 some years ago. And right now, I think other countries are looking at Japan and think that, the parliamentarian system might be better than presidential system, and LDP dominance actually is actually great for stability. And so it has worked reasonably well in Japan, and that's I give a lot of credit to LDP for taking up a lot of policy concerns that come from opposition parties. And then make those ideas their own and implement policies. Those are really small scale. Kind of, if right now rice price is an issue and the LDP is trying to address that issue, perhaps it will work. But in terms of more sort of bigger changes in the economy, that's why Japan has faced this lost decades of economic stagnation. In terms of making more bigger changes, that's not happening in Japan. That's the other side of the coin. So you have to take both positives and negatives from Japan if you want to change in that direction.
숙종.
저도 일본에 대해서 알기 때문에 잠깐 보충을 한다면요. 일본은 90년대 초중반에 자민당이 들어가지 않는 비자민 연립 정권을 아주 짧게 수년 갖고 자민당이 우위를 하는, 그리고 이제 다른 정당들은 작다 소리가 1.5 political party system이라고 하는데요. 저는 이건 건강한 민주주의가 아니라고 생각합니다. 정권 교체가 일어나야 되고 거기서 정당 간이 그 좀 이퀄한 세력을 가지고 일어나야 되는데, 그것이 잘 안 되는 이유는 한국인과 다르게 일본인들은 정치 참여나 이런 시민 능동주의가 굉장히 약합니다. 그래서 근데 또 좋은 점이 있습니다. 이제 풀뿌리 단위에서는 굉장히 생활 환경에서는 참여가 큰데, 이런 큰 정치에서는 불만이 있어도 거기에 대해서 적극적으로 참여해서 표출을 하지 않거든요. 그러니까 한국하고 굉장히 다른 시민들의 어떤 그 집단 행동에 대한 태도가 있기 때문에 이제 그런 문제가 발생하고 있고, 여전히 그 자민당 우위로서 정권이 계속 유지되고 있는 것 같습니다. 그리고 이제 신규 선생님이 아까 젠더와 계급 말씀을 하셨는데, 젠더 갈등이나 계급 갈등이 있다고 해서 그게 양극화로 이어지는 것은 아닙니다. 그 말은 사회적인 갈등이 있으면 이거를 어떤 정당이 나의 선거 전략에 유리하기 때문에 이걸 적극적으로 활용해야 될 때 비로소 일어나는데, 젠더 갈등은 좀 일어났어요. 다 아시다시피 우리나라 20대, 30대를 보면은 남녀 간의 정당 지지가 아주 극명하게 나타납니다. 여성은 민주당을 지지하고 남성 유권자는 국민의힘을 지지합니다. 그래서 이 젠더 갈등이 이렇게 드러나는 양상은 아무래도 민주당이 그 여성 친화적인 정책이라든지 그 여성의 여러 가지 그 인권적인 측면에 있어서 더 적극적으로 나섰기 때문에 이제 얻은 결과가 아닌가 생각되고 있고, 이것을 국민의힘이 만약에 게을리하면서 어떤 그 좀 반 페미니스트적인 남성의 보수화된 젊은 남성을 대상으로 해서 자꾸 거기를 강화하는 선거 전략을 한다면 그건 장래가 굉장히 안 좋습니다. 이런 여성층이 늘어날 것이고 남성들도 이것이 바람직하지 않다는 걸 알기 것이기 때문에 조금 더 그 국민의힘이 젠더 문제에 있어서 분발하셔야 되겠다는 생각이 들고요. 계급 갈등은 굉장히 어렵습니다. 우리가 보통 소득 수준을 보면 한국에서는 저소득층과 부자들이 보수당을 지지해 왔습니다. 그것은 이제 아무래도 저소득층 교육 수준이 낮은 데서 작동하는 것이 안보 논리라든지 동맹 강화, 그다음에 북한에 대한 반공의식 이러한 것들이 있기 때문에 여기에서 그 계급 갈등이 내가 가난하니까 나를 보호해주는 뭐 민주당을 지지해야 된다 그렇게 되어 있지 않습니다. 다만 이제 이것이 세대 교체가 일어나고 이제 어떤 직업의 이런 것이 일어나면은 조금 더 노동 계급을 대표하는 민주당 아니면은 시장을 중시해서 조금 더 친비즈니스적인 이제 국민의힘 이렇게 되면 이제 조금 더 나타날 것 같은데요. 다만 지금 이제 우리가 그 자산에 대한 얘기를 하고 있는데 자산 불평등이 커지고 있기 때문에 아시다시피 그 아파트 값이 큰 데에서는 항상 우리 25개 서울구에서 4개 구에서 계속해서 보수당을 지지하듯이 이제 그런 결과가 나오고 있죠. 그래서 이 점 역시 양당에서 유권자들의 욕구에 대해서 특히 주거 정책에 대해서 좀 더 신중한 정책들이 나왔으면 좀 좋겠습니다.
뭐 그냥 정리하는 의미로 질문을 드리고 싶은데 어쨌든 뭐 좋은 말씀들 감사하고요. 한국이나 미국이나 민주주의가 직면한 도전은 다 비슷한 것 같습니다. 차이가 있다면 한국 대통령의 문제는 주로 한국 사람들을 힘들게 하는데 미국 대통령의 문제는 전 세계를 힘들게 하고 있다는 차이가 있는 것 같습니다. 제가 질문 드리고 싶은 거는 여기서 국회에서 오늘 행사를 하기 때문에 그러니까 의회의 역할에 대해서 묻고 싶습니다. 그러니까 미국 헌법의 중요한 정신 체크스 앤 밸런스 견제와 균형인데 지금 그러니까 그 지켜보는 입장에서 보면 그게 미국에서 잘 제대로 지켜지고 있는지 잘 모르겠다는 생각이 좀 들고요. 또 한편으로는 이런 양극화의 시대와 민주주의 도전과 관련해서 의회 정치는 어떤 역할을 해야 되는지 그거에 대한 말씀을 좀 듣고 싶습니다.
Okay, so I think I'm going to give each panelist 1 minute for final thought, and then we can wrap up. Yeah, thank you.
Congress is the Article 1 branch in the Constitution, meaning it is, the most important. It is the people's branch. And the problem with polarization today is that the one party, the president's party, is basically abdicating its Article 1 role and responsibilities. It is ceding a lot of power to the president. And we've talked about how in the South Korean context, divided government can be a problem, but divided government is also an important check when the parties, when the majority party in Congress is different from the presidential party. It can be a real source of accountability. So I think that if legislators could see themselves primarily as, elected by the people to do a job, and it would take a few members of the Republican Party to defect from voting with the majority and to vote with the Democrats to hold the president accountable, which is what happened here in South Korea in December, then we could really see a different dynamic take place very quickly.
I don't know. As I've gotten older, I really don't like presidential systems because precisely, this split government where the president is of one party and the Congress is of another, and that's what tempts presidents to issue executive orders to get around, this blockage. And in a parliamentary system, that's not going to happen. So that's why, I would like to see a parliamentary system in the United States, but it's never going to happen in a million years.
I think the role of Congress in presidential system is to moderate the president's executive power, but also to facilitate compromise across different party lines. And it was along those lines, it was great to see two politicians from different parties coming here to have a civilized conversation with each other. That was great.
의회 민주주의는 굉장히 중요한데요. 아무리 참여 민주주의가 커지고 여러 기술적인 수단이 우리가 직접적으로 의사결정할 수 있는 기회를 줘도 의회 민주주의가 건강하지 않으면 좋은 민주주의가 될 수 없습니다. 의회가 하는 게 뭡니까? 유권자가 원하는 것을 좋은 정책과 법으로 만드는 것이죠. 그리고 이제 정부를 견제하는 것인데 그러려면은 몇 가지가 이루어져야 될 것 같습니다. 먼저 의회 내에서 민주주의를 해주십시오. 정당 간의 아주 극렬한 그 다툼으로 보여지는 그래서 의회가 제대로 협치를 못하는 것은 너무너무 안타깝고 제가 보고 싶은 거는 양당의 의원들이 중요한 정책에 대해서 서로 머리를 맞대고 연구해서 좋은 법을 만들어 주십사 하는 것이고, 또 집권당에는 대통령한테 휘둘리지 말고 정당의 자율성을 지켜달라는 것입니다. 그걸 위해서는 각 정당들이 좋은 후보를, 우리가 뽑고 싶은 진짜 좋은 후보를 내는데 정당 민주주의를 이루어 주십시오.
Thank you so much. It's really encouraging to see very active participation by young people, especially those working not in social science but in science and engineering. And I always say that democracy is not a perfect system, and then there's some backsliding, but in the end, I think liberal democracy will prevail. And then thank you for your insights and then joining our panel today. So I think you should host, maybe organize more forum like this for more discussion. So thank you so much for organizing this one, and then thanks 우리 최 의원님도 감사드리고. So I think I should let's have lunch. So thank you so much. Yeah, bye.